Hello, thanks for joining us today. So today we are talking all about the new media landscape. So thanks so much for coming along. I really appreciate it. So to get started, just to introduce myself, I'm Cheryl. I'm the Managing Director of Markettiers MENA. Hi, everyone. Also joining us as well, we've got Howard Kosky, who's joining us all the way from London, standing up today from his desk. So basically, we wanted to give you a bit of an overview. We'll give you a bit of an agenda first of all. So we're just going to start with who are we, in case you don't know, a bit of media insight background, and a bit about the impact of COVID-19 on programming. What we've seen basically, the reason we wanted to do this session really is because I think we're operating in a completely different environment than ever before. I mean, everything's changed now. It's turned on its head. The media is completely different. What they're looking for is completely different as well. And I think everyone has sort of seen a big shift in terms of some things doing really well, like podcasting, virtual events, live streaming, and other things literally kind of falling by the wayside. So how we've had to change and be innovative as comms professionals has really sort of driven, I think, doing business differently. So the purpose of this session is just to give you guys a bit of insight in what we're seeing from a broadcast perspective, and also basically how you can leverage these opportunities for the brands that you work for and also your clients. So hopefully that you'll go away with this with a bit of information to help sell things better, but also just really some knowledge just in terms of what we're seeing from broadcast perspective. We're also going to talk a little bit about virtual events. We're doing so many of those at the minute, even though things are starting to come back here in the UAE. We're still sort of in that kind of live streaming, virtual live streaming is big at the minute. So we'll tell you a bit about that. So this should be just a bit of an agenda. We'll rattle through some of the slides, and at the end, feel free to push your questions through, and we'll come to them at the end anyway. But first of all, to pave the way and to give a bit of context, who are we? So we're Markettiers. There's basically a big umbrella of companies under Markettiers. Markettiers is basically a broadcast consultancy, and we are huge evangelists of the power of broadcast to reach and engage new people via radio, via TV, and via online. So think of us really as a bit of a brand-funded newsroom, and we're a consultancy that advises on the best routes to market and how we can basically make your story famous. So that tends to be how we come at things, and that's really been what we've been doing during the pandemic, working with different brands. We worked with on the world's tallest donation box, which did very well in the PRCA awards, but the reason we can tell you about why things like that we did really well in terms of how we marketed that and took that to the different media. So Markettiers is basically the big kind of brand funded newsroom part of the business. We also have Census-Wide as well, and Census-Wide is our survey part of the business. Why did we set that up? Well, because we often would have a lot of different stories where there might be an absence of a news angle. It could be that we're launching something new, or we want to talk about education in the developing world, but there isn't really a kind of news angle to help us land that coverage. So we set up Census-Wide to do just that. So, 1,000 people in the UAE said this, 50 CEOs said this. This gives us the why now factor. It gives us the news currency to say, why are we talking about this today? So that's a little bit about Census-Wide, and it helps us then launch those stories when we start speaking to media about them and help shape them in terms of making sure that we're delivering our messaging. Then we have probably one I'm most excited about all of it really, but the podcast part of it is the 4DC part of things. So we set up 4DC a couple of years ago in response to this sort of excitement around podcasting. What we sort of thought of, at that point in time, we did some research. We traveled to the US, we looked at the global markets to understand what their podcasting landscape looked like and to see what the opportunities would be, not just in the region here, but also in the UK as well, which is also where we're headquartered. So the reason we set up 4DC is because there's a lot of podcast production houses, but nothing that really looked at it from a brand perspective, from a strategy perspective, production, distribution, promotion and measurement. That's huge. And there's so much that can be done with a podcast. And we felt that there was a bit of a trick being missed. And there's so much excitement around that at the moment. They're in fashion, but it's a fashion that we think is here to stay. So the whole reason 4DC came to fruition was to build on our audio experience of Markettiers. We've been delivering radio strategies for a number of years, and the podcasting part kind of was an extension of that. And then finally, another piece of the puzzle, which is part of our umbrella, is Through the Eye, which is our virtual events and live streaming piece. So virtual events, huge, big business at the moment, doing lots and lots of live streams. We'll take you through a few different case studies that we've been delivering from the likes of Alibaba through to the World Health Organization in the last 12 months, and really give you a bit of information about how you can bring your events to life or announcements that you're working on from a kind of live virtual perspective, because there's so much that can be done virtually, and it doesn't always have to be huge. You can do smaller things as well, but we'll just show you how the market's evolving. So it's all really feeds into this kind of new media landscape. And I think one of the first things we want to just touch upon is media insights in the media insights in the UAE. So what are we seeing from a kind of media perspective on that front? Well, radio, first of all, is still, the numbers are still there. So 89% of the UAE listen to radio every week. That puts it on a par with about the UK, which is also about 90% as well. What we also see as well is, I think, the evolution of radio too. So radio as well, the big players like ARN, they're going into podcasting as well. There's lots of the digital footprint for these different radio stations is also phenomenal. We also see as well the likes of, there's not a lot of speech-led broadcasting and radio broadcasting in the UAE. So we have our main interview slots with the likes of Dubai Eye, for example. We have Virgin Radio, which is obviously a lot more celebrity driven. So although there's not a huge number of opportunities like we might see in different markets, for example, like the UK, where you've got the BBC stations, you've got your commercial radio network, you can place interviews on there. There's still a lot of opportunities, and these are the ones that really people are tuning into and listening to. So there's a huge kind of trust factor there. We also see as well, I think that's the great thing about this region, is there's so many different nationalities and so many different types of radio stations that cater to different audiences. So there's a lot out there. Sky News Radio as well is also big business, and they're branching into podcasting too. So there's some interesting kind of insights when it comes to the specific audio markets of the region. What we also see as well from a media perspective in terms of how things are at the moment is TV is still high. So the UAE has some of the highest television viewership rates in the world. And I know we've got Ramadan coming up as well. So again, more people being at home, more people tuning into TV. A lot of people are choosing to watch international channels via satellite. And even in the region as well, we see things like NBC, for example. Most people actually listen to NBC not actually through the traditional TV itself, it's through the digital platforms. So digital footprints are winning big. So it's interesting to see how things are slightly moving along as well. We also see from a broadcast perspective, podcasts, again, winning big. We did our piece of research with the podcasting landscape a couple of years ago now for the UAE, but interesting to see how it's moved on now. So this was back when we did the research, 1.3 million podcast listeners. You might be forgiven for thinking, that's not massive, 16% of the population. But these are people that are actively engaged when it comes to podcasts, tuning in every week to a podcast. And that puts it on about a par with the UK. The UK's got about 18% of the population tuning in each week. So we're not really that far behind. The interesting part about podcasts as well, which we've seen from our research, is the huge trust factor people place within them. Just like we trust our radio presenters, podcasts are actually the single biggest media when it comes to trust, having those kind of high trust factor levels. And you kind of think, why might that be the case? I think it's that sort of intimate connection that you have between host and listener. So you kind of buy into that person and you kind of trust what they're saying. So that is a little bit around the trust factor as well. And even if you think about your own podcast that you're listening to, often it's the content that keeps you there, it's the presenter, and it's the subject matter that really sort of keeps you becoming that subscriber. So it's interesting to see how the podcast market is developing in the region. Good news is that most people now are familiar with the term podcasting. That's helpful for us and good for brands. And also as well, a lot of people, podcast listeners versus non-podcast listeners, they outspend. So a huge important thing for brands when they're thinking about doing a podcast is you're reaching a proportion of the audience that has a disposable income, they're digitally savvy, and they're a highly targeted audience as well. So everyone listening to a podcast is there because they want to be there. You're not an accidental listener because you actually have to seek out that podcast at the point of interest. So it's interesting to see. I think as well, another part of our research, which we did just in May 2020, so last year, and we did this at that point, we were always going to do it in May, but obviously it coincided with the start of lockdown. So it was good to kind of do the research at that point, because it was extremely telling actually in terms of how audiences were shifting and what types of media they were consuming. So in Saudi Arabia, 5.1 million, which is about 15% of the adult population, are tuning into podcasts each week. It's not actually on this stat as well, but something I think is very interesting from that piece of research we did during the pandemic, we found that 1 in 4 women tune into podcasts every week. And that's huge. So if you're thinking about the brands that you represent, if you're targeting women in Saudi, if you're launching a new fashion brand, or you're just trying to communicate an announcement to women, that is a great way to reach people, because they're actively engaged. The trust factor again is high, and they're actively seeking out content. So podcasts are booming in Saudi, and it's a super interesting landscape. There's so many podcasts now popping up in Arabic, which is interesting to see. We have obviously platforms like Angami as well. They're now listing as well on NASDAQ. They're branching out. So the whole ecosystem is very much geared around local content for local people. But as well as that, we still have the big international players like the Serials of this world, which really put podcasting on the map going there. So from a brand perspective, if you want to reach a very targeted audience, podcasts would be the way to go. But there's a huge kind of opportunity to think about how you can work that asset hard as well, not just from us purely doing at the production perspective, but from a distribution and measurement perspective too, and working that asset as hard as possible. So this kind of just sums up a little bit in terms of the radio, the TV, the podcast market, but what has been the impact on programming, and how can we, as PR professionals, how can we leverage that opportunity? So what we wanted to focus on here is, this is just an example of one media platform. So it's Dubai Eye, but it's a great example about how the changing in audience consumption habits has disrupted their programming. So Dubai Eye, they have their podcast piece now. They have over 1 million digital listeners each month. So people's habits are changing. We're not on the commute as much as before. That time when we're listening to the radio on the way in or on the way home, that is different. So whilst the numbers are still there, where we're actually consuming content, how we're consuming it is differently. So a lot of people actually, listen live via their PCs, via their laptops, via their smartphones. So how we get to that media is changing also. So we have the podcast piece. So media is getting very tech savvy. Even with Dubai Eye recently, I think the whole of ARN had to work from home for a while. And I remember at Helen Farmer's show in the afternoons, she had all of her equipment set up and she was doing it from home. So it's just how things are shifting now. Zoom for interviews, that wouldn't have been the case previously. I remember when we used to set up interviews all the time with Sky News, they wouldn't always want to do it via FaceTime, but now that becomes the default because they have to. So it's just playing into this new media environment where the Zoom etiquette has been how media are taking different content. But as well as that, there's always a little bit of almost Zoom fatigue. So how can we actually, as PR professionals, provide the media with what they want? But this is really just to say in summary that, things have moved along. Media is different now. We're looking at different platforms. They're more tech savvy, FaceTime, Zoom, Skype. That is how interviews are being done. And that represents a huge opportunity for us to get cut through within that type of programming. And this is just now to come on to Okay, so we've talked a bit about the disruption of programming. How can we capitalise on this? So these two case studies, we've got the Global Grad Show, which was part of Dubai Design Week back in October last year. And we've also got the world's tallest donation box on the other side, just as I think good examples about how everything can come together and how having the right assets can really kind of land you that kind of trophy piece of coverage. The great things about these is we had some great assets and stories, but that wouldn't have translated unless we made sure we had the right ingredients we need. So first of all, compelling visuals. Despite the fact that everyone's used to taking Zoom now in terms of TV interviews, there is a little bit of Zoom fatigue that's set in with the media. So whatever we can do to provide strong visuals, to make sure that we're kind of providing the media with something slightly different and exciting is always going to win big. We're not always going to have the best exciting visuals. I mean, the world's tallest donation box was the campaign to commemorate the fact that 10 million meals had been given to communities affected by the coronavirus. And to celebrate that, they lit up the Burj Khalifa in typical Dubai fashion. And that was the great images and drone footage that we got to sell into media. So that powerful footage was always going to be great, but that alone wouldn't have got us all the coverage and cut through with Reuters. We needed to have the other right elements. So having the right spokesperson to deliver that message, also having the right supplementary footage as well. So color footage that you can use to help build that opportunity. So pictures of the meals, parts of the meals going on planes and being boxed up and taken to different countries that are affected by coronavirus. Having all of that footage is super helpful. On the other side of the fence, Global Grad Show, again, this was a whole story about how grads had come up with some interesting different ideas, from different products to concepts to inventions that will help change the way we live. So it's a really cool kind of initiative, part of Dubai Design Week, as I said, but the reason that went well was because there's a lot of legwork done in advance to make sure we provided media with the right content. So reaching out to each of the graduates to make sure we had graduates in different countries. A huge target of this was the global south. So we reached out to different countries as well to have a range of different voices. And this enabled us to get that kind of human interest factor. So yes, we'll have the brand spokesperson talk about the key messaging, but making sure we're actually offering something really super interesting and colourful to media. So they'll always want to take more of an independent spokesperson where we can. So trying to find someone that help complement that. So we had so lots of different people take part in interviews, and we set up interviews in the likes of BBC World Service, BBC Africa. We utilised access to some of the graduates that came from universities in the UK and set up opportunities with BBC Radio 2. Similarly, people from Canada, the US, etc. This then enabled us to really sort of push out and extend the reach. But where that's not possible as well, it's also worth looking at footage that you've got. So we took footage from the different products that people had created, and we created B-roll. So B-roll is basically loosely edited, media-friendly footage that we can then package up, and then it's almost a little bit like a library. So you have your kind of your front end and your back end, and you have your chapters in between. But chopping up that footage is great because we can then edit that together. What we typically do is put a watermark on the footage as well, and then we send that out to global media. And we've got relationships with all of the different global media around the world. So when we're sending that image, that footage out, it means that every single time that a media plays that footage, we get an alert back to say, oh, BBC World Service have played it, Euronews, Reuters, which is great from a kind of selling it back perspective, because it's so difficult, as I'm sure everyone knows, to monitor for coverage when it goes worldwide. How can you manage and monitor everything? Well, you can't really, in essence, but what we can do is try and get as much as possible, and the watermarking is a great piece. So B-roll is always great to do. In summary, it does the legwork for the media. You're giving them content to work with. At the moment, people are operating with reduced resources. We were speaking to Sky News Arabia earlier, and we know that they're a lot more reduced than they were 18 months ago in terms of staffing. So whatever we can do to help them, they're still tasked with putting out the same amount of output every day. We can help and deliver on that front. And it's all about, I guess, speed of delivery. And that's another thing that works out really well with the world's tallest donation box, getting that content to news as quickly as possible, acting with a sense of urgency. You can't, if something happens that evening. It needs to be out to media that evening, even if you have to work through the night. But the results are going to be worth it, because if you leave it 24 hours, it's old news. So it's really sort of capitalizing on that urgency and restless nature to make sure that we get cut through where we need. This was a fun campaign. So Mars Hope Probe, again, this is just showing really how the media has sort of changed and how we can work with the media to give them what we need. Our sort of role on that was to help with the creative activation of some of the campaigns. We worked on quite a cool one, which is basically 2 moons were spotted in the desert. They're actually projections, so it's all kind of a bit of a spoof story. But the idea is that the Mars Hope Probe, when it entered orbit, the first thing it would see is Phobos and Deimos, which is the two moons from Mars. So we created by this big projection, working through Mullenlow, a big kind of activation of these 2 huge moons that were put up with a big crane. And this was kind of just to say basically that the UAE is welcoming Hope Probe to Mars, and this is what some of the first images that the Hope Probe will see. So our job was to get those pictures and to get that footage out globally. It was a bit of a challenge as well, because at the same time we're competing with the main story, right? So the main story is the Mars Hope Probe enters the orbit. That's what all of the media are going to cover. So how can we make sure that we not only ride the news agenda with that, but make sure we get cut through for hours? So we did that again through crafting the context, having those great visuals, having that spokesperson, creating timely footage, and it worked well. We've got at the moment 2,300 items of individual TV coverage, which is insane. So it's good to see how that's sort of translated, but that is just being quick, getting stuff out, riding the news agenda, making sure we've got all of the assets in place. I'm just going to play you a little bit now, some of the coverage highlights, because it just shows with great, powerful visuals and a good story, and making sure we've got all the ingredients lined up and good media contacts, what you can achieve.
Well, a strange phenomena has been taking place in the United Arab Emirates, with 2 unidentified objects being spotted in the desert night sky.
We've got a special report for you today. We've received multiple videos from Dubai in regards to something captured over the night skies.
What looks like multiple sightings.
Right off the bat, I have to say, I've never seen anything like this in my entire life.
Maybe it was a rocket launch?
Well, the United Arab Emirates government has now admitted it was a projection of the 2 moons of Mars, and the stunt was designed to go viral.
Казати, що ж бачить зонд під час наближення до червоної планети.
Y ese fuera el caso, ¿por qué el fenómeno? Dos lunas enormes que han dejado atónitos pues a más de uno. Až bolygót az első űrszondájuk.
Použili najnovšie technológie a neviditeľné obrazovky.
Chińska agencja kosmiczna zaprezentowała pierwsze zdjęcia Marsa wykonane z odległości 2, jak się nie mylę, milionów kilometrów. Teraz
en el cielo podrían ser el resultado de actividad extraterrestre.
So it goes on a bit. So yeah, good piece to see. And again, through tracking where that goes, we can sort of start to plot where that's gone globally as well. So that's super useful. So we get typically get the date, time, where that's been placed, and the media channel that it's on as well. So just good to see from a reach perspective, when your client's asking you to kind of get coverage in the US, Asia, whatever, how can we make that story work? But obviously this was a very big campaign anyway, but almost because we were actually coming at it from a very niche perspective, basically our client only really needed us to make sure that we got the coverage around the creative part of it. We needed to make sure that we worked that campaign hard from a creative perspective, because we're almost competing with the bigger story as well. So it just goes to show that, we can really get through with a quirky story and targeting the right media channels. And commercial network relationships, another thing. So aside from the kind of broadcast, so the TV and the global piece, we're also seen in the new media landscape, there's been a lot of emphasis on what we've done is how can we make How can we control the message? How can we make our campaigns go further? How can we speak to different radio stations to really land an impact? So what we did at the start of the pandemic is that we worked actually with different radio networks in different markets, the UK being one of them. And we've also looked to ink sort of specific deals so that we can work with different radio stations and actually guarantee coverage on the UK radio commercial network. So this means that we can create our own interviews in-house, so allowing for control of message, having that interview delivered via Zoom or virtual content, and then making sure that we then really sort of package that interview together and then distribute that across the network, making sure that we can guarantee coverage on 200 plus channels and stations. So reason for doing really control of message and reach, we can make sure that we get that content out, and that's something we've been doing with the Cabinet Office over in the UK every other week for the kind of foreseeable, really. Basically every update they have about the coronavirus, the pandemic, how they're dealing with it, we're packaging up content that we can push out and reach a lot of people with very quickly. That's crucially 100% controlled. So from a messaging perspective, we can always guarantee that what is put together is what goes out from an output perspective. Similarly as well, we've delivered the same with the US network too. US is a notoriously quite a difficult market to crack. You always need a very, very, very strong story, good angles, but so it's always possible too. But one thing we have done as well to really sort of make sure that we can get some excellent coverage and to make sure we're really so working that content as hard as possible is we've worked with different shows on the US TV network to make sure we can craft different interviews and then seed that content out to guarantee placement there. So again, control of message is absolute, and if clients are sort of very specific on where they need markets of coverage, it sort of helps sort of underwrite the risk really of a piece of content when you know that it can be placed across these huge different TV networks, which will guarantee sort of significant reaching in terms of audience numbers. So this is just an example of one we did for Jumeirah Foodies. The story was it's a big travel brand trying to attract audiences from the US and the UK. So the US was a key one for them in terms of attracting tourism and visitor numbers. So we worked with the team over there and created a whole piece around their Foodie Kids, which was launching a new healthy menu for families when they go on holiday. And because of the time that we were operating in, travel was really sort of limited at the moment, but people are still thinking about their holidays. We wanted to kind of be part of that decision-making process up front. So I'll just play you the first 30 seconds or so of this piece, just so you can see how the piece looked when it went out on the US network.
We all like to indulge a little bit when we're on vacation, and when you're traveling with kids, you try to make better and healthier food choices because trying to convince kids to eat healthy is always a little tricky. But one hotel chain is trying to encourage the rest of the industry to invest more in healthy options on children's menus.
New study released today shows that for 58% of parents, encouraging their children to eat healthily is the top challenge they face when on holiday. The global research, commissioned by Jumeirah Group, surveyed more than 5,500 parents of children aged under 12 years old. It showed that 22% of parents say their kids tend to eat much more unhealthily when on vacation. As a result, 42% of parents are calling for hotels and resorts to do more to provide healthy eating options for children while they're on holiday. Jumeirah Group's team of foodie experts, led by Chief Culinary Officer and former Michelin Guides Global Director Michael Ellis, have addressed the issue with a brand new child-friendly, healthy menu.
We decided to do some research to find out.
So it goes on. So yeah, basically that just shows just how that piece can work. So we would craft the content, we would film that in-house and then actually distribute that across the network and even provide the presenter read-in for the US presenters as well. So really kind of great crafted content and just making sure that we're delivering what we need to in terms of the messaging on that front. And then it comes to podcasting. So now we've sort of talked a bit about the radio landscape, the TV landscape. a couple of different campaigns as well that we've worked on, as well as how we can actually work in terms of control of message. From another sort of control perspective, but from an audio perspective, we have the boomer podcasts that we've seen in this new media landscape. So podcasts themselves, they're nothing new. They've been around since 2005. They're kind of an amalgamation of the word broadcast and iPod, so the word podcast. And basically now that they're really coming to their own. And although they're in fashion at the moment, they're very much a fashion that's here to stay. I think even just looking at from a sort of contextual perspective about podcasts, we're seeing, the number of deals that Spotify did last year to overtake Apple. We're seeing Apple slightly try to claw back as well. So they've got how specific shows now only on Apple TV, which are complementary to the podcast that they're delivering on. We've also got Angami, as I mentioned, that's now listed on NASDAQ. So how the actual local landscape as well is really kind of stepping up in terms of providing localized content for local audiences, crafted by local audiences. From a brand perspective, there's so much that can be done. Actually, I think from an internal comms perspective, there's even more of a powerful argument for podcasts as a way to reach people by the one device that's universal to all, and that is smartphones. So we've worked on a number of different podcast strategies. MasterCard, Fortune Favors the Bold is super interesting, and I'll show you a little clip from one of that episodes that we worked in a little bit. And then also Mubadala as well, an Arabic series, 24-part episodes that we're currently working on at the moment, and all around building a kind of nation of innovators. So there's a lot that can be done from a granular perspective. The most exciting thing for me, I think, is once you've got your podcast and your strategy, and you've thought about your hosts, your guests, what that content's going to look like, who you're speaking to, how you're going to sort of work the format of it. The interesting part comes from the distribution perspective. So you put your podcast on all the different aggregators. There's about 18 different ones, from Spotify, Apple, Deezer, Stitcher, Audioboom, Acast, Omni, Podbean, Buzzsprout. There's so many. But apart from that as well, that's kind of when your work starts. And I think a lot of people step away a bit from podcasts once they've done it once they put it on the distribution channels. And no, that's really when we need to start working harder as PR professionals. So think about your YouTube strategy. Have you filmed that podcast? It can be done virtually. We use AI software. So every podcast episode we do, we've got a bit of an op-ed that we can place as well. Thinking about broadcast interviews with your guests, you're creating a digital toolkit with the guests that come on the podcast so they can then promote the hashtags on there. Social media, huge. What can we do from an audiogram perspective? Can we create little pull quotes that we can take out? Can we create small little video snippets? From a sales perspective as well, can that be distributed to your customer or your client's database? Can that podcast episode be linked into your email signature, so every time you send an email, people are getting a link to listen to it? So there's so much that can be done. I think often people sort of miss that sort of step, and suddenly they're like, oh, why has only 100 people listened to my podcast? Well, probably because you need to do a few of the back end things. The measurement perspective is super interesting as well. Podcasts are so easily measurable, which is a great thing and a great way that you can demonstrate ROI back to your clients. So easy one, downloads, number of subscribers, but also looking at, how long people listened to that podcast to, sentiment as well, checking the number of reviews and what people have said about that. Typically we'll use our research agency, and we'll research people's thoughts and opinions on the podcast after every 3rd, 6th and 9th episode. So we can say, oh, what did you think of it? Did you like the presenter? Is it too long? Is it too short? So all of that content really sort of brings things to the fore. And at the moment, we're seeing huge numbers when it comes to podcasting. And I think the pandemic has been very favorable in terms of really complementing and pushing forward and pushing the paper forward when it comes to podcasting too. And what we just wanted to show you here is just a small little video, which is a trailer. So I think often everyone thinks of podcasts, it's an audio piece, right? It's radio on demand. So you think of it very much within that perspective. But we know, podcasts can also be very visual. I'm listening to a Lex Friedman podcast at the moment and I watch it on YouTube. So how I consume content is working different. And even from a brand perspective, you can do a lot through video trailers to promote that piece too. So this piece with MasterCard, basically it's all around financial identity. That's the main piece of MasterCard's sort of player on the podcast. But how it's been done is cool, it's edgy, it's a bit urban. And this trailer, which I'll play now, just really, I think, brings it to life. So basically the point is, something to consider when you're doing your podcast series is how you can bring in all these different elements to work the content as hard as possible.
We all have questions about money, but these questions don't always have clear-cut answers. And what's worse, we're often afraid to talk about them. When was the first time you had to talk about money as a couple?
Whenever we were about to move in together.
What's your Do you have savings?
Yeah.
I'm Ashley Seaford, writer, artist, and once again, your host. All our ideas about money are wrapped up in this season's biggest question. What is my financial identity?
And so this is really the critical time for us to be thinking about how we invest in infrastructure, how we do it so that it benefits everyone.
So there you go. So it's making a bit of a podcast, bringing it to life in quite a gritty sort of urban way. And hopefully you'll agree, it sounds super interesting. You can download it as well. And we're also working on the Middle East and Africa version of MasterCard's podcast. So it's going to be nice to actually work with different presenters and really craft that content locally too. But just a really good way about ultimately, when you've got your podcast, what can you do to make it as interesting as possible? And the barriers to entry are low. It's not like a big video campaign. The good thing about podcasts is that it's authentic content and it's meant to be conversational and organic. You're not meant to edit every and R out of the podcast. It's meant to sound natural. So again, that makes people's lives a little easier. So key takeouts. So covered a bit of ground so far, and I'm going to hand across to Howard in a second. But summary, really, media appetite. What are we seeing at the moment in this new media landscape? Well, audience consumption numbers are still there. Radio is still huge. But basically, what we're seeing is people consuming content slightly differently. We're seeing a huge disruption of programming content too. So Dubai Eye, for example, having the podcast strand of things, Zoom interviews being the default way now that media are taking content, but also not forgetting the need to help the media as much as possible. There's less media, there's less resource. So the more legwork we can do in terms of creating assets for them, the better. And the good thing for us as PRs is that we're helping control that content. On the control of content front, again, we have that key control of message that we can do through the UK radio networks and the US radio networks and TV networks too. So other ways that we can reach people globally. What we need as well as access to people. Yes, there's been a bit of a Zoom fatigue from some of the media. So always the more color footage we can get, the better. But yeah, just using your assets and working them as hard as possible, whether you're creating a podcast, a piece of B-roll, or just pitching a TV interview. So lots that really can be done. And from an ROI perspective, there's so much specifically from a podcast way that you can really sort of garner that coverage and sell that back to clients too. So hopefully that just gives you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'll stop talking now and hand over to Howard.
Thanks, Shez. So as Cheryl mentioned, Alex, saw you had a few questions around on-demand and podcasting. I'll put a couple of notes in the chat, but I'm happy to chat through at the end as well. So just to give you an overview, this is the kind of virtual events live streaming part of it. As Cheryl mentioned, so I can say to you in 12 months, virtual events have gone from what was started off as a distressed purchase, in the sense that the physical events were being mothballed. Events still had to happen. People were looking for a digital solution. Virtual events kicked in. What's interesting is in that 12 months, we've now transitioned to a point where virtual events, digital events are actually bona fide on their own right, becoming the mainstream way of how to run. That doesn't mean that people are not going to go back to physical, because I think we're all agreed the model will be a hybrid moving forward. But this part is only 10 minutes, is to show you the realms of the possibility in terms of what is doable, what is capable, in the sense that actually this we are doing as a Zoom call. This for me is not a virtual event in the true sense, because we are restricted at the moment. We're on Zoom. We're using Zoom's own platform. What's happened in the digital world in virtual events, if you can imagine that venues have been created digitally and they're called platforms. So it could be in the real world in Dubai, it could be we were deciding to use the Royal Meridian for an event. It could be Media One Hotel, the Burj Khalifa, Burj Al Arab, and obviously you've got physical venues. In the digital virtual world, you've now had virtual venues being built in platforms. So you've got people like Events Case, Six Connect, on 24, and I'm going to run you through. But our role as a business is to be agnostic to platform, agnostic to venue. So in truth, you would choose your venue based on what you want from your event in the same way you would have done in a physical world. So the key thing is having a remote virtual gallery. And the reason I showed this slide, quite simply, at the moment, the one thing that happened when we all clicked join the meeting, which is great news for all of us, is the webcam kicked in. Now, in essence, in a non-voyeuristic way, we have 22, I think 24, how many people are on this call? 24 camera sound operators in your homes. Now, at the moment, your cameras are off, you're muted. But in essence, I have the capability of having 24 remote camera and sound operators physically somewhere else. And it's free. Now that has had a huge impact both on traditional broadcast, but in the virtual world. So from my perspective, all I'm interested in, if we've come via Zoom, Teams, WebEx, Blue Jeans, I don't really mind. But at the point someone clicks join, I want the webcam to kick in. That's the bit, because I have the ability to lift that software file off of Zoom, and I can bring this into my desk here. At the point I'm in control of it here, it means I can moderate it, curate it, and control it. So as an example, if these are 4 lovely people from Shutterstock, right, any source, but it could be that in the middle of a presentation, you could have some B-roll, some GVs or PowerPoint, VT. You might have many different assets that you would normally curate for a physical event. So if you can imagine, if you're at a normal venue for a normal event, there'd normally be an AV room at the back of the venue somewhere. The producers would be sitting in there and they would have pre-carted up all the assets that they want to run to screen during that event. You do exactly the same in the digital and the virtual world from a virtual events perspective. The beauty being is, as soon as I've lifted the camera feeds, which are basically input feeds from everyone on this event, into my mixing desk, I can then curate the event as I want, I can mix and I can stream back out. Sorry, it's just taking a little bit of time transitioning slide. So as an example, and the beauty of that is I can simulcast. Now, for example, those 4 people, or even in this event itself, if I wanted to, I could stream the same event on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, or brand portal. Because ultimately, as long as I'm in control of the stream out, I'm using plugins into the different players and platforms that exist. The reason this is important, I often see an awful lot of brands, they might be doing an influencer activity. They are completely reliant on the influencer and using the influencer's own Instagram channel. Great, I get that. I get the power of the influencer. However, why be exclusive just to that channel? In other words, if you're in control of the stream out and you plug in into Insta Live on the influencer's channel, I might actually decide I also want to stream that at the same time on Facebook or via Twitter, because it might be that my audience groups aren't exclusively on Instagram. So from my perspective, if you're looking to maximize reach and impact, you want to simulcast as far and as wide as possible. Cheryl, do you want to just chat through the Cadillac example you did in the Middle East?
No worries. So basically with, so Cadillac is an interesting one. So this was a virtual launch of the Escalade, and that was it was all filmed in advance. So it's basically done as live. So we actually went to the showroom, a big showroom, and we also rented a big TV space as well. Everyone was socially distanced. We filmed the actual content as well. And then we streamed that via Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. But interesting way to do it, because it was all pre-recorded content, and literally when we wanted to go live, we did a big countdown on the day as well, and then we had a ticker across the screen. It was promoted heavily across social media too, so everyone knew. I think it was even promoted by text messages and WhatsApps as well. So all of the big database of Cadillac customers got told, come here at this specific point in time, tune in for the virtual live stream of the launch of the new Escalade. And that was delivered, as I say, across all of those social media channels, with people sort of liking, sending in their questions afterwards, and then the brand saving that content afterwards in terms of on-demand version, so they could then send that out across to their customer database afterwards for those who missed it or who want to watch it again. But I know from a kind of commercial perspective that went really well. That was basically one of the key pieces of activity that they did. And yeah, I've heard from a sales perspective, yeah, they did rather well.
Cool. Alex, I've just seen your question. In terms of simulcasting across different platforms, we use our own encoders. So Restream you can, but from my perspective, I tend to use Vimeo as a player, and then from Vimeo I stream out. So basically I have a separate encoder for each platform, which means I'm robust. But yeah, things like Restream, there's other bits of tech out there. But the key thing is, as long as you are controlling the output feed and you've got the right plugins for each player, you're good to go. This case study is for Alibaba. This was just a couple of weeks ago, and all I want to show you here is a different type of platform. So this platform is called Hopin. So it's quite new to market, and it's all around the capabilities of what you can do with different screens. So what you've got here is, so if you're doing a virtual event, think through from a mental flow perspective, exactly the same as what you want as an experience as a delegate or as a speaker from a physical event in the virtual world. So I want registration. I want to know who's attending. So you can craft your emails in advance. You send out the email, you ask people to register. The reason registration is important is that you can actually then direct someone's walkthrough in the virtual event. Whereas if a physical event, if someone's accepted an invitation, they turn up at the day on at the venue, they register, they come into an auditorium, they could be free to wander, they could be free to travel. In the virtual world, of course, you can do exactly the same, have someone freedom of movement. However, you also have the ability through the digital platforms where someone has registered, you self-select. I can direct them. So it could be I've got one speaker, they come into the auditorium, there's a plenary session, they see the first 20-minute, half an hour opening piece. But if I know who they are, where they are, because they've registered, I could automatically redirect them into another breakout session or into another seminar. So the capabilities in the digital world are phenomenal. But what I'm showing you here is the power of the green screen. So quite simply, this is, well, I say quite simply, this is Alibaba's Gateway to Europe conference over 2 days, a couple of weeks ago. Registration. Now the green screen, we used a presenter from CNN, CNBC, to front it. So she's anchored in our studio. The green screen image at the bottom left is exactly that. It's Studio 5 here, it's a green screen. The software that's now available, we've decided to use Tower Bridge in London in the UK as a virtual backdrop studio. And then you can see top right, that's how Hannah looks on green screen. So she looks as if she's actually in a studio with Tower Bridge in the background. You can have her sitting at a desk. And then what we do with different speakers, we actually brought the speakers in, again and the key thing is using Zoom Webinar, was our camera source feeds in, and then we projected them onto the screen sat behind Hannah there. So it felt as if Hannah was interacting with the speaker. So it's as if you're watching Sky News Arabia, but you're creating the experience to the viewer that's an immersive, engaged experience. So imagine coming and watching this. That screen at the top right and the bottom right, that the platform there, you can see it gives you the opportunity to reception, the speakers, the inventory, you've got network rooms. There is no real comparison between turning up to a Zoom or a Teams meeting event and going into a virtual event platform such as Hopin, because these platforms as virtual venues are designed to give a much more immersive, engaging experience. Slides are taking quite some time to change my end. The next one here, this is an example of On24. So the reason I'm showing you this is an event that's put on for influencers and journalists. So this is in the healthcare sector. So the images I'm showing you here for GSKV, the top right-hand part of the page is the events page. So in essence, when you're sending a link out to people to invite them to the virtual event, when they click on the link and they come, obviously it's gone into their Outlook calendar or their iCalendar or the Gmail calendar. You get prompts, you get reminders. But when they come to the event, they land at an events page. It then opens. You've got speaker bios, you have a media repository area, you have press releases, videos, whatever you want in there. You've then got on the right-hand side the actual media player itself, which we're in control of, and the moderated Q&A bit underneath. The bottom half of the screen, which no one gets to see other than ourselves, is actually the green room. That's your behind the scenes kind of area where you're coaching your spokespeople, you're making sure they're prepped. You'd have done your tech checks a few days out, make sure the broadband connectivity at home's okay, webcam, HD quality, lighting. No one wants to look up someone's nostrils when they're on a virtual event. So all the prep goes in beforehand tech to make sure that when your speaker turns up, the only thing you want your speaker concentrating on is speaking. You don't want speakers turning up and worrying about how the tech's going to work. It has to be fluid. The moderated Q&A is your engagement technique. It's where someone can type a question where it says Q&A. They submit the question. It's not a live bulletin board forum. The question then comes into us in a moderated gallery. We decide with the producers and the client whether we think that's a question they want to field. They field the question. But we are in complete control in this instance of the 3 camera feeds you're seeing in the media player was the 3 that we had selected at that moment in time to deal with those particular questions. But we was behind the scenes, I've been saying, right, Jodie, put your camera on now, please. You're gonna be live in 3 minutes, Jodie. Jodie puts the camera on, we chat to Jodie, right. Jodie can be live in 10 seconds. And in 9, 8, 7, 6, Jodie, you're live in 3, 2, 1, camera live. And Jodie hasn't had to change. Jodie's just there, but we're in control of her screen. We're in control of the fact that we're using her webcam source as one of our feeds to put into the media player. Okay, and all I've done here is I've just mocked up an example of how an events page could be created. So it's just made up of constituent parts. So this was for Dubai Global Connect, just an example. You create your media player, you get speaker biogs, global city of trade, bit of a logo, custom banner. But it's a page of HTML that sits within a virtual platform. So the ability to create your own unique environment for a client is fairly straightforward. You don't need the digital or the web team of yourselves as the client or of the brand involved, because an iframe and a platform layers over the top. So the good news is, as a PR comms function, you can own this end to end if you want to. Obviously, it'd be good to get the buy-in of the digital team in terms of amplification and distribution, but in terms of the hosting and the running of the event, you can run it all yourselves. Another example of one, LinkedIn. I'm pleased to say we're actually one of LinkedIn Live's partners. Obviously, LinkedIn Live is still in beta mode. Obviously, if it's a brand, if you've got over 10,000 followers, you can run LinkedIn Live, which is the player within. You can also frame over. But even though we run LinkedIn's own digital events, we use Zoom Webinar as our camera source. So what I'm showing you there on the right-hand side, this event had 50,000 global attendees. So the bandwidth is there, the capability, the stretch is there to be able to take the view. But the top image there, you've got speakers side by side. But again, the way the frame is paved, you haven't just got that classic Zoom or Teams black outline screen and a couple of images, right? What you're using Zoom as your camera source feed that we bring into the desk here, and then we push out and framed into an events page like that. Likewise, in the middle, you've got a feed with live translation over it, and you've got subtitling over it, and then you've got a bulletin board sitting on the right-hand side. And the bottom there is your entrance screen. That's where you walk into an auditorium. You've got your different walkthrough opportunities. Now, this is another platform. This is the platform called 6 Connects, another virtual event, another virtual venue on the market now. But you can see with 6 Connects, a much more advanced end on graphics and motion. This is moving towards 3D avatar style greeting. So again, each of these images would have been full screen at that moment in time. So if you take the top right, or you come into the on-demand version, you walked into, you get greeted, you've got a choice of Ask the Experts, you've got the LGM resources, you've got your breakout rooms, you've got the media wall. But again, it's to make it a more engaging, immersive experience. So instead of literally just turning up, clicking a link and bang, everyone's in the room, no, you want to make it as engaging as possible. And then if you take Rewired as a client we work with, just as an example, the way in which Rewired X, the virtual event, because the physical couldn't take place, was put together. Again, it was a virtual event, but the look and feel of the event, as you can see, there was a lot of design capability that's been put into this to make sure as a program of activity, you're doing as much as you can to replicate the experience of arriving at a physical event. And this is example of some of the rooms. So, at the top left there, you've got an image that would be full screen. So it feels as if you're sitting in an auditorium with your 4 keynote speakers. And you can see the way in which the platform has been designed is each of those speakers is taking, they're all coming via Zoom, but they're taking up major imagery in the set of the speakers, right the way through. Then bottom left, you've got the more personal experience. Bottom right, keynote speaker, Gordon Brown. And the way that image and that bottom half quarter would have filled your full monitor or whatever screen you're watching it on. So it feels as if you're actually at an event rather than just turning up on a Zoom or a Teams style environment. Then you've got one we did for the World Health Organization. This just gives you an idea of speed of turnaround. So this is about 2-3 months into COVID and the pandemic really hitting hard. Africa, no one was talking about. Yet Africa was likely to be hit the hardest and still is for very obvious reasons. So the World Health Organization in Africa wanted to hold a press conference, but no one could travel. So the simplest way to do it was, again, just use iFrame platform, bring your speakers in. It gives the delegate, gives the viewer a destination point. So for journalists, they had 5,000 people tune into the live stream of the press conference. But again, it's an event page. So rather than turning up just onto a Zoom, onto a Teams meeting or WebEx, you're actually driving people to a page where you can have body copy, you can have information, but you're in control of the imagery, you're in control of what people get to see. And the reason I'm showing this one is the plugin capability of platform now. So again, you may have noticed I'm a fan of Zoom. Not Zoom because I use Zoom as platform in terms of doing all my calls on Zoom. Obviously, I would be doing this on Zoom. But I love Zoom because as a programmer and a bit of a techie, the capability to lift the coding in Zoom behind the scenes is more capable than the other platforms that are out there, although they are doable. So in this particular instance, Leeds Beckett University are trying to attract students through clearing. Right, so we know Insta and Insta Live is the platform they need to be in, but we want a Q&A. Now, normally with Insta Live, if you use Insta Live's own software, the maximum you can have in a tower is 2 people. No, we want a Q&A of 4 people. So what we've used, again, I've used Zoom as my camera sources in, I vision mix internally here, and I push out through Insta. And this will give you an idea. So you've got an example of how it appeared. And the important one is on the right-hand side. What you've got there is on Insta Live, I've got a frame where I've got my 4 spokespeople doing a live moderated Q&A. You can see 1,100 views. You can see the comments that are starting to come in. So just to give you an idea, that actually it could be that Insta Live is your channel that you want to engage with your audience. But the good news is you don't have to use Insta Live's own software to run that. Right. The only reason I throw this in is obviously it's the PRCA, the organisation that we're doing this for today. This was their international summit last year, and actually I've had an email this morning from Francis asking about the one for this year. But quite simply, with an international summit over 2 days, we had obviously 750 delegates thereabouts in 35 countries. But the way we land people, we brought them into an events page. So again, rather than it be Zoom, so we're in full control of what the viewer gets to see. So that the media player window that's got the 5 spokespeople in it is being controlled by us because we're serving into an iframe. So the key takeout in this modern world, multiple remote guests from anywhere. So the good news is, the reason why, again, I mentioned to you, we're seeing a huge acceleration in the adoption of, is that people aren't traveling as much, whether that be for offsetting carbon footprint, the sustainability issues, or whether this is because of the fact that, you can't travel because of travel restrictions. Stream on all platforms. So managed service solutions, great KPIs. There we go. That's it. So someone was in control of my screen. I have a feeling Cheryl's been playing around with the controls of my screen.
I had no idea. I just thought I was trying to click on the questions, but thank you anyway. I must have skipped it.
So that is it.
Now I'll go onto that screen. Thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, hopefully that was interesting. And yeah, I know we answered a few questions as we went through. I know Alex has got a question. Actually, Howard, I might divert to you for this one, if okay. Alex was just asking, what do we recommend for multiple video streams on Facebook or YouTube? Is Restream a good choice?
Yeah, I think I answered that, Shez. Yeah, Restream is decent, but as I said to you, Alex, personally, I run through our own encoders. I'm just a control freak. So if it's possible, what I would suggest is you have your source feed different encoders, and then literally a separate feed going to each of your platforms. The Restream does the job as well.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it. I'll send across the presentation over to Hayley if she wants to circulate that. I know there's been a recording that's been taking place of this session anyway, so I know that will probably most likely find its way to YouTube. But yeah, of course, if you've got any questions, please reach out to Hayley or to Howard or myself, and yeah, we'd love to help. So thanks again, everyone, and yeah, see you next time.